بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. السلام عليكم. I want to welcome everybody to another beautiful opportunity to take the gems that come from the Quran and the Sunnah and the guidance that we have been blessed to have preserved and passed down through many generations over 14 centuries to gauge how do we perceive our life and its role and its purpose in preparing for the eventual reality of the end of our life and the meeting with our Maker. So, as we know through the gems of guidance that we've been going through, we've been taking different looks into the Aqidah, the creed. We've looked into the reality of fiqh, Islamic legislation and legal theory. We've looked into the hadith sciences and so forth. So today we're going to take a look into a well-known universal science that Muslims obviously have taken a strong concern over, and that is the reality of history. In Arabic it's called tarikh. So the reality of history is obviously something that human beings have been trying to record throughout, the history of the annals of time. But obviously we have a period in time in which people started to become literate and taking literate records of scrolls and scribed historical accounts of history. So today we want to look into the first thing about why would one study history. Now if you go to a high school kid and you ask him, what's your favorite class? Oftentimes history is not going to be the favorite class. Some people perceive it as boring. And it's definitely not boring if you're reading for a purpose. And so generally when you look at studying history, the purpose behind it is going to be to learn from the history of events and human perspective of those events. Now and then. And there's a big gap and difference between centuries as they go on in how that event was perceived and how it was recorded at the time, and then how we look back at that now. And so part of that in recollection now, as somebody who lives in the year 2013, we should be looking through history and its various periods and different realities from different nations and different cultures. We should be looking at human progression and human regression. Those are the two realities that become obvious in looking into history. Now, that is obviously in the eye of the beholder. People view the concept of progression differently than others. People view regression or decadence, getting worse, in different ways. So obviously we are Muslim. So we are viewing, and what's going to come out in this class is going to be very interesting. The prominence and the precedence of the Holy Quran in our lives and what it means to us is going to become very evident and clear. And the prominence and the precedence of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is going to become very clear in looking at world history. So we're going to see how we obviously view the morality or the progression of human people based upon what we know from the Quran and what we know from the authentic Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Because we have these values that have been revealed and preserved for us that tell us what is right and what is wrong. What is the straight path and what is the divided, crooked paths that lead you astray. We know those things. And that's been defined for us. And we looked in previous, seeing how the sciences come together of Islam. So it's very important that if we didn't get to attend all of these different gems, looking at the different sciences, to see how they all relate very much so. So in our Aqidah, that has a lot to do with the way we look at history, our belief system, our creed system. The science of hadith helps us to know what do we take for sure from history and which is doubtful. The Holy Quran gives us the general idea and the fiqh, the law that is understood therein, about what is a good reality and the reality of previous nations and revelations that came to them, and how that might differ from our reality in our prophethood, in our law that was legislated to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So history, we are looking into it to see how can we see where people have erred and people have veered from the straight path, and how people have grown and progressed on the straight path. That's why we're looking at history. And so we're seeing a practical example, and that's why history is mentioned in the Quran, by the way. That's its only purpose. It is not just narrating events for entertainment, as many people want to try to have a relationship with history. Like they say, what should we tell our kids to teach them Islam? Tell them stories. Because it's entertaining. But let's not forget the point, right? We're not watching a movie, it's not entertaining purpose. Even if you're watching a movie, you should see it in the lens of aqidah, morals, values, and you should judge things accordingly. And not allow yourself to be affected negatively, rather see a way to see things in a positive light. So when we look at history, we're definitely looking through this lens of Islam to see how did people fail? How did people move away from a beneficial progression as a human race? And how did people succeed and grow? And what are the examples, what are the human developments that happened in order to bring that to fruition? So that's why we're reading history. That's the purpose when we look into it. So these lessons that we take help us to know how to make decisions today. When they say history often repeats itself, for us, that should mean when people established a good standard, and that was a hadith of the Prophet. Man sanna sunnatan hasana, right? Whoever would establish a good mode of conduct, then that will be followed and rewarded, and you will get the reward of those who followed you. So we should look at those prophets and righteous, pious people, and those who rallied around them and followed them and companioned them, and we want to take that and establish that in our reality. Now, as we said in previous times talking about Islamic law and legal theory, there's culture and there's religion. So some people say, well, in the Prophet they were doing things in these very literal, exact, detailed manners, so we should do it exactly like that today. No, they were doing that because that was the reality they lived in. And that example was a little bit different from the way it was in the time of Abraham, right? As it was in the time of Muhammad, as it is now. If the Prophet ﷺ was born today, there are going to be various factors born in America today. God forbid the Prophet ﷺ was born in America. What will we do then? As some people have that strange attitude. Yeah, but if he was, then there would be different aspects to who he was and how he lived. But the principles and the guiding objectives and functional motives and intentions will be there. Doing the same thing, creating a positive influx of goodness and bringing social welfare to the forefront and removing corruption from the society. That's what he was doing in concept. So there are different means to knowing history. There are different methods to knowing history. Who can tell me the best reference or resource for history? Al-Tabari? Al-Tabarani? What's the best reference or resource to knowing human history? The Holy Quran. If you want to be sure about something that happened, that is the only way that you will be 100% certain. Now, who was here last week? I burnt some people out. I'm not going back to that place. It's too complicated. Some people challenged me. Imam, you're always saying basic stuff. We want to hear something we never knew. And then when we did that, they were like, man, I don't understand what you're talking about. There's a balance to be made in structure. Who remembers the word tawatur? What does tawatur mean? Okay, Shahrukh, you raised your hand.
I remember the word.
La, brother. Yeah.
I brought a blank here.
You have
Is it continuous?
Continuous is a decent translation for the word, right? Continuous in different chains, yes. But what is the Islamic legal terminological meaning? Yes, sister?
Wasn't it the highest form of Sahih?
It's the highest form of the chain of transmission of things. Can anybody remember the standard? What was the lowest that each chain needs to have?
3.
No,
Huh?
10. That was
10. Yeah. 2 is mashhur. 2 is aziz. 3 is mashhur. And then between 3 and 10, there's various phrases, but mashhur is often used. But 10 and up, and even some scholars said 15 and 20 and 100 and up, they say that's tawatur. But 10 is the best, most common. So you have 10 people in each link that in many cases did not know each other, saying the exact same thing that they're narrating. Now add to that, that's just the actual agreement of statement according to people. Then add to that the science of jarh wa ta'dil, the science of human evaluation on verifying should we accept from that person. Right? So they're an honest person, an upright person of mainstream beliefs, practices, values, and add to that they have a very good memory and a knowledge, a very strong language of the knowledge of the language that they are narrating in, right? So that has to have 10 of each. Now the Quran's tawatur has at least in the Sahaba's time hundreds of people who memorized the whole entire Quran exactly the same. There's no difference or argument amongst them about what is the Quran or what is it like. Then from them you have thousands, and then from them you have tens of thousands, and today on the earth there are people who, in the millions, who have memorized the whole entire Quran from a chain that goes back to the Prophet in that chain of people. And anybody who gives ijazah will not give ijazah just because they can memorize and because they know Arabic. They check their character, their knowledge, their seeking of knowledge, what others say about them. When I know people that I know that have ijazahs, and the sheikh, before he will take, he will ask people, who do you know? Who do you study with? Who's your sheikh? And they'll call them. Who is this person? Before they will take you to read from memorization to them. Right? So the Quran is the most authentic document in the history of mankind by provable evidence. It's not our iman talking here. This is fact. This is not my faith. This is historically, tangibly provable. Right? So as a document, if we're trying to account for history, the best place to go is the Holy Quran. What happened? And so there's an important point about that. So like, with all due respect to the Bible, and we'll get to that in a moment, we noted it in, I think, a dawah session of the Quran. It was the Quran seminar we did on the Quranic sciences, talking about this point in the Quran. So the Quran keeps referring to the leader of Egypt in the time of Prophet Joseph, peace be upon him, as the king, right? And Malik. But in the Bible, it keeps referring to the leader of Egypt in that time with the title of Pharaoh. But as archaeology has established factually, the term for Pharaoh did not happen until 300 years after that point in human history. Right? So how would anybody be saying Pharaoh to refer to the leader of the Egypt when that concept has not been archaeologically available? Unless somebody 300 years later was writing about it back then, and that's the common phrase nowadays, and they're trying to account for those events because of a lack of strong chains with very well documented historical preservation of this book, right? So that's where we would say the Quran is undoubtedly the best place to go when trying to establish a knowledge of human history. So the Quran is not a history book. It gives you knowledge about history that is relevant to your growth and development as a spiritual entity struggling with the material world in the test of life. So yes, there are stories from history told to us in the Quran. But if you'll notice, particularly those of you that have read the Bible, the Quran's interaction with human history is very succinct and precise. It gets to the point very quick and says an interaction and solves that situation according to faith, disbelief, and hypocrisy, the three possible realities of human hearts. Right? And so it assesses the situation of the people and their reality and where they went and where they were going with what they did as a result. Right? So that is the Quran's way of dealing with history. It's all based on guidance. It's a manual of guidance, the Holy Quran. But it has history in it for the purpose of guidance. The Bible, on the other hand, which is a very valuable book that you can learn a lot from. Okay? And it has a lot of historically proven evidence that there is a lot of strong, not tawatur, but there is strong evidence of revelation. A large percentage of that book is still revelation. But if you look at how it narrates history, with all due respect, when I was being raised, and I've heard this from even people who are preachers today in churches, it gets boring. And so, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, the so-and-so walked across the valley, and he met these people, and he talked with them. Nothing, no fireworks, no point of guidance, no heart-changing reality, just this long, drawn-out story of chronological events. Right? And the whole book follows that, by the way, because the Bible is a history book. Right? Pretty much. It's chronological events, beginning, middle, and end. That's how it functions. The Quran is not a history book because it does not go beginning and end. Even the first verse that was revealed is found in the 96th chapter. Right? So it's definitely not like that, right? But it does have that for the purpose of our growth and development. So now we can know what's the second most reliable source of knowing human history. And this is also by proven fact. This is not a matter of faith. It happens to be that it fits in our faith. But our faith is very scientific, as we've been seeing for many weeks now. The hadith. The sahih mutawatir hadith. Which its tawatur level is lower than the Quran, but at least has 10 people on each line of chain of transmission who are all accounted for who they were. Like, for example, if you ever read the Bible, and you look at the beginning of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it says the gospel according to Matthew. Well, isn't the gospel Jesus' revelation? Why are we getting it according to Matthew? And who was Matthew? What's his last name? What's his grandfather's name? What's his tribal name? You know how many Matthews and Johns and Marks there were going around back then? Lots. How do we know exactly which guy it was? Well, later on some people said, well, we're assuming that it's this one. It has to be, right? We don't allow that in our system. So those are differences upon how. And if you look at any New International Revised Standard version of the Bible, you look at author, the word author, next to the chapter, you will see, I would say, a third of them anonymous. You don't know who's the author. For us, that invalidates it. Even if you go back 2,000 years and find a Dead Sea Scroll, but they're still anonymous, that's great. We've shown that 2,000 years, there's some pretty strong 90 percentile plus continuity about what was known then. But this is talking about prophets that were living 5, 10, 20,000 years ago, God only knows. Right? So that is a different way of assessing verification. So the hadith, the authentic hadith, when it says something about human history, now, here's a point where faith comes in line. When the prophet is saying, which we know he said it because it's a mutawatir hadith, something about history, it's our faith that he's a prophet and he got that knowledge from Gabriel, right? But it's reliable. It's reliable going back to him. And obviously our faith in him is not built upon some old guy that said, I'm a prophet. There's a whole boatload of evidence of miracles and prophecy fulfilled and prophecies in the future and so forth and so on that proved his prophethood, right? So the authentic hadith is another good place. So now we can assess our knowledge of human history and how it affects us. How much do I read the Quran? And how much do I read the authentic hadith? As a spiritual person learning from the reality of the people in history, as a spiritual entity who is trying to grow and develop, learning from the mistakes of the old, and not to remake those mistakes. As someone who wants to see the successful models in human history, and to incorporate those models in my reality. So now we can assess where we're at spiritually, right? The Prophet ﷺ and his companions were all human beings, and his companions were not prophets. But they had their wives and their children, because many people say, that's sheikh stuff. This is secularism brainwashing people. That's for sheikhs. They read all that stuff. No. We don't have hierarchical monasticism that controls the masses and tells you that's how it is and we have the sacred knowledge and you don't. No, every believer is addressed in the Quran, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. And it tells us to read and think and contemplate and believe and follow the Prophet, follow the Messenger, look at the historic. أولئك الذين هدى الله فبهداه مقتده. Says in the Quran, Surah Al-An'am. Those are the people God guided, the prophets. So follow their example. How can we follow their example if we don't know about them? Now, have many of you noticed that in the Quran, some of these prophet stories have been repeated? There's a wisdom behind that. Unfortunately, some people's faith got weak as a result of that. But we'll talk about that in a second. Let's go through the assessment. So the next level, obviously, in establishing our reliance upon a historical event that's been narrated is the weaker hadiths. The Hasan hadith, the Aziz hadith, the Gharib or Ahad, Munfarid hadith, as we talked about last week. Remember all this stuff? Go back, research, review. We need to know these things. It's part of our ummah. It's part of who we are. It's not scholarly terminology. These are scholars are the ones that have to go through all the rigorous process of researching who that was and finding what book he's found in, his biography, comparing it with the other one and all that, and now making a ruling on the hadith. But we need to know what is the different rulings of the final ruling on the hadith. But most Muslims don't know. And that's the state we find our ummah, where the basic person is missing the basic knowledge that they need to be a practicing Muslim of understanding the religion. So, the lower the authenticity, the less reliable that we have. Now, that being said, that doesn't cancel out its possibility. Now, if we like, for example, how many of you heard of Alexander the Great? Okay. By the way, he's not Dhul Qarnayn, just to solve that one. So, do you know, how many of you think you have a good idea of Alexander the Great's life and accomplishments and who he was and all of that? Most people that studied history think they do, right? But do you know the chain of transmission by which we took this is fabricated? It is mawdu' hadith, right? But we all accept it. If you go to the atheists and you say, what about Alexander the Great? I'll tell you all about it. And he thinks he's like telling you the real history and he's very comfortable about that. But then he doubts things that we said the Prophet said, right? But we have a scientific, it's very ironic what we're talking about here. We have a very scientific way of being sure about what he said, and that is so unscientific and just so biased and humanly influenced that he's taking as, oh, that's all secular stuff, that's normal, we accept it without question, right? So that's an interesting point. Then you have the Israelite tradition, the Bible and the other. How many of you heard of this term Israeliyat?
The Israeli, especially generations of those stories from Israeli tradition.
MashaAllah, student of Awala Maududi in the house, for sure. Yeah. This is good. This is good. Israeliyat is the result of Jewish and Christian theologians, priests, monks, rabbis who embraced Islam historically in the early centuries of our nation. And so these people, when hearing the Quran and talking with the scholars of the Quran, they would suggest what we know from our tradition. So our scholars said, if it's not completely against teachings in the Quran and the Sunnah, we'll just put it on into the tafsir. So the Ibn Kathir tafsir, originally when he wrote it, is actually full of Israeliyat. I would say you got about 6 volumes is the Ibn Kathir is about like that, originally. But when you get the tahqiq, which is kind of what we talked about last week, which is the value of the influence of one of our great sheikhs of our era named Sheikh al-Albani, Nasruddin al-Albani, rahimahullah ta'ala, he encouraged everybody to authenticate Islamic knowledge. Okay, maybe in his attitude and personality, maybe he was a little bit tough, and he had reasons behind that, but he was sincere, we assumed the best about him, rahimahullah ta'ala. One of the great accomplishments he did was he pushed so many hadith student scholars in all of the different masters and PhD thesis programs to authenticate books. So they took Ibn Kathir and they broke it down to a very small 3 volumes, taking out all of the fabricated and very weak hadiths and Israeliyat. Now the tafsir is more pure. And now we can know about the Qur'an's meanings with a very careful lens. So what's interesting, Sheikh al-Albani, that reality was previously done, but not as a standard that many people were very highly motivated to do, thousands and thousands. Historically, some characters would do that. Sheikh al-Albani said that's something we should do to every book. Rahimahullah ta'ala. Every book should be done with this. He said, حتى نتخلص من الخرافات والأساطير والأباطيل في التاريخ التي رويت عنا. So we need to remove ourselves from all of these, what do you call them, mythologies or old stories that don't have authenticity behind them. So he's applying to tafsir as a science, the science of hadith, which was historically, those were separate. So he was bridging that gap. So alhamdulillah. So but Israeliyat could benefit us, right? But it should not be passed to the common person. A scholar should navigate in assessing the use of those for making tafsir of the Quran. For just learning it and knowing about it, right, like reading the Bible, that's fine. Anybody can do that. Particularly, it's very valuable and highly recommended in our reality, in which we're a small minority living in a biblical, Christian, generally society. We need to learn what the Bible is saying so we can understand who we're dealing with, what's their belief, what's the basis of their belief, how to properly relate our beliefs to them and help them understand us and build some sort of a reasonable relationship with them. So that's something we should all do. But before you make a tafsir of an ayah of the Quran according to something that was passed on by rabbis and priests, I think we should be very careful. Because there have been a lot of stories. Wallahi, when I got married, mashallah, my wife was trained in Syria with many great scholars when she was young. It's a scholarly group of sisters that are well known there. And many times, because I just, trying to stick with the basic stuff. And she would tell me, you know that story and that story? And I was like, well, I didn't hear that story. On this ayah, this one, Surah Najm, that's the story on that one. I didn't know about that one. Well, many of those we studied and we found that those are Israeliyat. Those are stories that are in the old tafsir books that sheikhs love to give in khutbah because it helps their khutbah be very long and interesting and new information, right? But that information often is not very reliable at all, right? As a historical context. Was it a true fact that happened for sure? We're not sure, right? Particularly with the imams. We had, mashallah, one sheikh come one time and he was talking about some story. Imam Shafi'i was in the basement and some sister came down to ask him, and then he prayed, and then the wall, as a miracle, just came down all by itself, and then he went out, and somebody came and asked me about that. I said, I've never heard that hadith. But it could be. I'm not claiming to know all the hadith, that there was tons of thousands. So then whenever I researched it, I found it's a very weak narration. It's not a proven fact that happened in the time of Imam Shafi'i. Some guy wrote it in a book that knew of Imam Shafi'i, but we don't have a chain of narration or anything on that. We don't have other witnesses and so forth. We're talking about establishing what we call karama, a miracle that happens to other than a prophet, right? Which they did happen. There are miracles that happen to other prophets. But we have to make sure about the chain of transmission. It's very important. So then we have general account of human history. As we said, human history is at the hands of the one who's writing it. That's a fact. So the person who's writing the history is going to put their bias in there, for sure. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said very clearly to his companions about anybody who wants to narrate anything about his teachings, he said, مَنْ كَذِبَ عَلَيَّ مُتَعَمِّدًا فَلْيَتَبَوَّأْ مَقْعَدَهُ مِنَ النَّارِ. Whoever would lie about me, knowingly, intentionally, plan for a place in the hellfire. This is very serious stuff. Because now you're causing people. Right now, if we look at some of the ideas and beliefs people hold very dearly that think that's going to make them go to heaven, that was some guy made a lie up at some point and said that's from the Prophet, and we should all believe in that. Many people got deeply emotionally attached to that idea, and now many people are going to end up in the hellfire as a result. Isn't it? Very serious, right? We should be very careful before we narrate things to other people. So, as we said, the human flaw is in the books of history. Human error, human flaw is in there. So now we move to the next point. How many of you heard about Qasas al-Anbiya? What is that one, Sheikh?
I don't think Qasas al-Anbiya, basically, where the stories of prophets and mostly from, Israeli
Yeah.
literature.
That's the story of the Prophet. MashaAllah. Very good point. MashaAllah. Should we get the Shaykh in that? Yeah, we need to build that. MashaAllah. We're glad to have him as a board member. Alhamdulillah. Having people with this type of knowledge is very good on the board. Alhamdulillah. So the Qasas al-Anbiya, the stories of the prophets. If you take just what's in the Quran and the authentic Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which I do have a book that I downloaded, which was made by a Shaykh that's adamant about authenticity and being very careful, it's very small. Each prophet, other than the Prophet Muhammad, Moses, Abraham, and Jesus, right, Noah, which are the Ulul Azm, the 5 grand, great, powerful, influential prophets of history. Other than those, very small amount of information that you'll find. And that was intended. It's not necessarily relevant to us. What we know about the lives of the other ones is very important. That is why God put emphasis on them in His last revelation for all people to know about. So so now we can kind of understand this. What the Quran put heavy emphasis and the Sunnah on, which was preserved by divine, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. Indeed, for surely it is we who have factually revealed this scripture, and we are surely its preservers. So that is probably the most emphasized linguistically verse in the whole entire Quran. Do you know that? When you say "Inna nahnu nazzalna al-dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun," there's so much emphasis in this, right? He is the one that preserved it, revealed it for a reason. We need to know what is relevant to our spiritual growth. So that is where the focus should be. So now people are saying, but I got this Ibn Kathir book of Qasas al-Anbiya. It's big, man, mashallah. There's all kinds of stories. We telling our kids all these stories. Well, most of that is very, very weak in authenticity and not reliable. It is taken from biblical narratives or narratives that were passed down through oral tradition, through rabbinical teachings, right? They became Muslim. And so what Muslims did, here's how the Muslims did this. Here's how they incorporated it. The Prophet ﷺ says, حَدِّثُوا عَنْ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ وَلَا حَرَجٍ. And this is an evidence, this actual fact of our history, that discounts the weak hadith that says that Umar prohibited us from reading the Bible. That's a weak hadith, particularly because all of these scholars narrated the Bible and the rabbinical teachings throughout the tafsirs and the teachings of the prophets of the old, right? So those prophets' messages, we have to be careful what we accept and what we narrate about them, right? So, primary focus and need as a Muslim is to learn those stories which were repeated and talked about in little differences here and there. The reason why anything is repeated, imagine how many times we had to tell our kids. I have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old. How many times you have to tell them? What if you stop telling them? Will they learn? No, they will not learn. That's why we have to keep telling them. You have to keep your cool and telling them. That's the jihad. That's the struggle right there. Yeah. But that's a fact. People have to keep reading and researching and reassessing the same information to make sure that it affects who they are. Make sure that they understand it and it means something to them. And that they've grasped it, right? So you have to re-look into those. So if you, like I said, in our context, we live in a society that are Christians and also some Jews and others. But biblically, people, even atheists, are very aware of these concepts that are in the Bible, right? So we have to be able to understand where they're coming from. So for us to read those things is valuable, right? So now we have the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, which is called, we call it the Arabic word seerah. Seerah, a account of events usually related to a person, right? Account of events were usually related to a person. That's the seerah, the biography of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Do you know why we should read it? And this ayah from the Quran, it should have a heavy impact on all of us. The Holy Quran says, النبي أولى بالمؤمنين من أنفسهم. Right? The Prophet is more important to the believers than themselves. So now, we can assess our love for the Prophet ﷺ. لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى أكون أحب إليه من والده وولده والناس أجمعين. صحيح البخاري, متواتر hadith. None of you is a true believer until I am more beloved, and the Prophet ﷺ is one talking obviously. I am more beloved to you than your father, your mother, your children, or anyone else in the whole world. So, what do you do to someone that you love? You want to be around them, don't you? You want to experience their companionship. Sheikh Amr Khalid, Allah yahfadhu, was giving a lecture one time it was the RIS convention. And he's giving a tafsir of the meaning, وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ فِيكُمْ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. Know that the messenger of God is among you. Right? So that he asked the crowd, is that for the Sahaba in their time? And many of them said yes. He said, and the Prophet is not among us? And then he said, you guys have done a big disservice to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who with his divine power over human wills and desires caused the Prophet Muhammad's life to be the most recorded and meticulously verified life of any person in world history by 100-fold. He did that for us. Now how much do we read the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ? How many times do we read the seerah a year? Do you know that there's hundreds of seerahs that have been written with different angles? I would say most of them have about 75% same events. There's 25% different events that you will find, and there's 100% different scholarly analyses and advices as a result. To keep a regular relationship with the seerah, to read the life of the Prophet ﷺ, to read his hadith, to read more hadith in his life, to keep reading that and reading different analyses of it from different scholars with deep training in the sciences, to help us understand what's relevant and important and how do we live accordingly. So now we can assess where we're at in our love for the Prophet ﷺ. And we can see where maybe, some of us, we might need to improve ourselves. It's very important. This ummah is stuck in a cultural understanding of Islam that's very bland and superficial. We have to be honest. Who's that? Imam's hard on the Muslim. We have to be honest with ourselves. We're in a very tough state as a nation of people in the world. It's only going to be that we're honest with ourselves about our shortcomings, and then we start to assess it with activism, with a strong intention to fix. I've talked with various people that go to lectures and this and that and the other, but I don't see where people are changing, and they're wanting to spend time researching and analyzing how my faith and religion, which is preserved and abundant, can regulate my lifestyle. So that's very important for all of us to do. Now, many people are studying and preaching from the seerah with preconceived bias. Preconceived bias. Either they were raised from a certain background, or they've been indoctrinated to a certain narrow understanding of Islam, and now they're reading into the seerah with some narrow focus or bias. So for example, right now, this news is trying to convince us all there's this big problem and prevalence with what I call fake jihadists or heretical jihadists. And that's what they do. If you look at the history of Anwar al-Awlaqi, he was an amazing preacher and teacher and got through to the hearts, and we really soaked it up. And then one day you saw that he started to make this big deal about, see these wars, see this fighting, that's the most important thing from all of the seerah. Jihad. We have to fight and show these disbelievers. And if you look, there are Muslim groups that have said, look at the seerah of the Prophet. He was never great and never honored until they fought wars. So we need to be great and honored through fighting wars. So they look at one part of the seerah and they say, that's the seerah. That's wrong. Then you have the seculars. Those of you who come from an Arabic background, have you ever heard the phrase, al-ummat al-arabiyya wal-islamiyya? Coming from Muslim scholars. So I sat with a sheikh in Kuwait, we won't say who he is. He's a very prominent sheikh. And I asked him about that. I keep seeing you on TV and in lectures, you keep saying al-ummat al-arabiyya wal-islamiyya. I said, are you trying to cover secular and religion at the same time? That's an interesting balance you're trying to square there?
Translate it.
The Arabic and Islamic nation of people. So he's combining between the two. That those are both relevant. So what he said kind of led me to the attitude that I have about my Americanness. He said, we have people that are watching, that are here, that aren't very serious about Islam. But they see Islam as a valuable part of Arab history. When they read Sirah, they read these Arab people made this religion. So that's a good part of who we are. Sometimes they misinterpreted or did it wrong and we didn't like that. We don't agree with this part and that part. So they secularly analyze the Sirah and they see it as an Arab guy's invention. So we're Arabs, so that's part of us. And they see it like that. So I said, but Sheikh, you're preaching to Muslims. And we have to make clear that yes, we're part of a human family. And they have rights upon us, all of the human world. But in trying to mobilize the masses, let's not confuse our religious identity with our cultural identity. And he said, I can't do this. I have an agreement. Whenever I talk on TV, because I'm in a state that's a dictatorship. And they expect me to talk like this. So God bless America for the freedom that I can make clear the difference between those things here. Right? So yeah, yes, we're part of an American country. And if I'm talking about Americans in general, which I'm asked to go to churches, to Occupy rallies and others, I'll talk about us as Americans, because I'm American just like anybody else, and as a Muslim, I have a positive role, and I would hope that they would perceive it that way, because of what I have to offer, and what I'm pushing, and what I represent. But when I'm preaching to Muslims, I'm not making it that the only Muslims that I see myself tied into are the American Muslims. No. That's an incorrect understanding. I'm part of the Ummat al-Islamiyya. There's no what. I'm part of the Muslim nation of the world, religiously speaking. And I don't see anything wrong with a Christian thinking the same way. He's talking to Christians. These are people who believe in what he believes, and they're motivated by the same scripture and beliefs and value system, and so he should talk to them directly when he's talking about spiritually growing and doing something for them. But now when we're talking in an arena that is cultural, then we talk cultural. And when I bring my values, I'm not telling you these are Islamic values that you should accept as Islamic. I'm telling you these are good values that you should accept as something beneficial to America. Right? So I think, wallahi, the Sheikh was trying to help me to see it in the way I understand it. But I just felt like that attitude was being a little bit ethnocentric. I kind of felt like that. Because what about all the Muslims who aren't Arabs? And which are the vast majority. So at any rate, that's more of an aqidah issue. The Prophet ﷺ, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو اللَّهَ وَالْيَوْمَ الْآخِرَ. In the Prophet ﷺ is the best example for you. For whoever would want to meet God on the last day in a good state and plan to be happily judged with a contentment from divine providence. Okay? That means you follow the Prophet ﷺ. قُلْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُحِبُّونَ اللَّهَ فَاتَّبِعُونِي يُحْبِبُكُمُ اللَّهُ وَيَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ. Right? If you really love God, then follow me, the Prophet ﷺ was commanded to say by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Imran. Okay? Then follow me. And then God will love you and He will forgive you your sins. So, you have the Sufi group. When they read, many of them, they choose to read the Sirah of the Prophet and they see mystical, divine forces and people's deep worship and remembrances. And those are part of the Sirah. As is that the Prophet Muhammad was an Arab, and as is there were wars that happened and fighting. But that's not all there is. That's not all there is. If you ever talk to a person from the Shia interpretation of Islam, I'll give you one great example. We have an authentic hadith in Bukhari, which says that there's a weaker hadith which explains the circumstances, but the authentic hadith says that in front of thousands and thousands of Muslims in Arafat, the Prophet ﷺ took the hand of Ali ibn Abi Talib who raised it up. He says, أَنَا مِنْ عَلِي وَعَلِي مِنِّي أَهْلَ الْبَيْتِ فَمَنْ وَالَى عَلِي وَالَانِي. I am from Ali, and he is from me. We are from the same thing, from the same lineage. He's my cousin, he's my son-in-law. So whoever gives allegiance and love and kindness and respect to him is doing that to me. Right? The history of it is that Ali was a young man. At this time, he was close to in his early 20s. Whereas most companions were like 40, 50, 60 years old. And Arab culture, till this day, is deeming a 20 is a kid. Who is he? Right? But Ali is a man who has now put his life on the line and sacrificed everything that you can imagine of a noble family lineage and wealth and all of that to be a Muslim. And he soaked up boatloads of knowledge and companionship from those knowledgeable, scholarly, pious, righteous companions. And he is seen as a leader amongst them. So this is the case in which Mecca has just been opened. And all these new people that were polytheists yesterday and the day before embraced Islam and say they see Ali walking around like he's proud of his deen and a leader amongst the Muslims, which he is. And they started to question that. And so they went to the Muhammad and said, well, who's this little cousin of yours to walking around here like he's somebody? And then he did that. You see now? Context. Right? As we said, the hadith da'if can be used to give context to an authentic hadith. Right? So when they see that, they say, see what is actually happening here is that the Prophet is announcing to all of those people, according to your Sunni tradition, the most authentic nature, that Ali will be his successor. And whoever will follow Ali as his successor to the leadership over the Muslims should give their allegiance to him. That's the way they see seerah. But none of us, who were the ones who narrated and believed in that hadith ever since its inception, understood that from it. But because they're trying to read into it some indoctrination, preconceived notion, they're trying to read into the seerah to fit their desires of what they want it to say. So that's unfortunate. The anti-Islam group. See, Muhammad did this, so he's an epileptic, whatever, and this and that and the other. Yeah, they got whole websites full of this junk, right? If you ever find yourself reading it, don't. It's shaitan, it's a disease to your heart. It's not good for you to read this hate and this twisting of facts and bad translations to support an ideology which is hate. You should not waste your time with that. It will mess with your heart, for sure. So that's the anti-Islam agenda. You have the politicists. We call them Hizb al-Tahrir. I've met some of them, very intellectual people, some of them very pious people, but they look at the seerah, it's all about establishing an Islamic khilafah. It's all about an Islamic state. Yet in the Quran, you cannot show me one verse that says, from our priorities or something that's important is to establish an Islamic khilafah. Nothing, not one verse in the whole entire Quran says like that. What they will do is, they will bring a ayah that says that I will leave in the earth a khalifa. But that ayah is very general, and it's talking about Adam being created as the leader of mankind, as the leader of the earth. And that he will success as the leading people on the earth. Genus or whatever, genome. So we have that. Some people focus on certain personalities. I want to be like Omar. Look at Omar radiallahu anhu. But he's one guy in the seerah radiallahu anhu. There's Abu Ubaidah, there's Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, there's Bilal, and we should learn from all of them, right? They all have amazing examples. Some of them made mistakes. Are those prophets? Right? One sheikh checked me on this when I was like, I can't help it. I was born similar to Omar and somebody I'm very aggressive in trying to establish what I'm sure of from the Quran and Sunnah. He was like, but isn't it that Omar was mistaken sometimes doing that? Why don't you just try to follow the Prophet? Or at least Abu Bakr. Good point. So, what do we learn from this? If we're going to read the seerah, we should read different seerah. And we should read everything in context and trying to understand why that situation was and relate it to the other situations and see it as a progressive development of a people who are in Jahiliyyah. They don't know anything. And they're not sure about their religion. And so God is slowly training them, and the Prophet is taking the exact same route. The famous story. The Prophet is standing there, some guy walks in the mosque and he goes over to the corner and they're like, oh my God, he's relieving himself. And so the companions want to go jump after him and beat him up, and so the Prophet doesn't lead the guy. Obviously he doesn't know what he's doing, right? Why would you assume he's intentionally coming to pee in here, right? So then they told him, afterwards you tell him, we don't do this, this is a holy place and all of that, and then we'll just take some water and clean and purify that, and that's done. Look at the Prophet. He's understanding that person's circumstances. The whole seerah is like that, growing people according to their reality. So we should read history and try to take that example in developing our lives, our families, and our communities. So the companions. Why should we read about the Prophet's companions and the followers, the tabi'een? Because the Holy Quran said, والسابقون الأولون من المهاجرين والأنصار والذين اتبعوهم بإحسان رضي الله عنهم ورضوا عنه وأعد لهم جنات تجري تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا ذلك الفوز العظيم. So the ayah is very clear. The early Muslims who embraced the Prophet in Mecca and went through humiliation and torture and abuse, and then those who embraced them in immigrating to Yathrib, where they established the city of the Prophet from the Ansar, these two people are the people who we should take our examples from, and whoever follows their example to the best of their ability will have the contentment of God upon them, and they will have an eternity prepared for them in absolute bliss in the gardens of paradise, in the presence of the divine. So that's why we should read about their stories. So that's it, inshallah. That's our talk for today. Any questions on that, inshallah? Yes, brother.
What surah is that from?
Surah Tawbah, number 9, chapter 9, verse 100. One's the sister got a question. Go ahead. Go ahead, sister.
What tafsir did you recommend that we purchase and read instead of the
No, Ibn Kathir, the one that they have in English translated, it does have human ijtihad in it, but it took out a lot of the narrations for the English reader. So some of the ijtihad in there, you should bounce that off scholars and read other analyses of it, but that's a good one. I would say the best one, and it's a linguistic analysis from an Azhari sheikh who has the general knowledge of the sciences. It's Sayyid Qutb, towards understanding in the shade of the Quran. Then you have towards in the shade of the Quran. It's on kalamullah.org.com. That one. We have it on the library as well. Towards understanding the Quran as well, Abu Ala Mawludi is an excellent conceptual understanding of the Quran. We have that on the library as well. Towards understanding the Quran. Now, Sister Aisha Bewley has done a very good translation of the first of Surah Al-Baqarah from Al-Qurtubi. Very nice translation there. And the Noble Quran, the one that the Saudi one, they've done a tafsir which is including all of the major tafsirs in it as well. That has a lot of very valuable, and they've been meticulous about authenticity of narration as well. That's a good one. Okay, yes, brother, you had a question.
Yeah, I was thinking about you saying the hadith is science. What's scientific about the hadith?
Oh, everything. It's very key. So I think do you get the mass email?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, you would know. You would know if you got the mass email.
Twice a day.
So yeah. So inshallah, we'll get you signed up afterwards. But so what we'll do is, if you can, when you sign up, if you can ask, I would like to have, because we did 2 programs on the Hadith sciences. So it is probably one of the most effective, meticulous sciences known to man, to be honest with you. Particularly in this field of verification of events and facts. Any other
Where
questions?
can I find information on the Israeli?
A book of introduction to tafsir. It's translated. Ibn Uthaymeen is the writer. It's translated. A good English book. The introduction to tafsir. Bilal Phillips has one as well. Introduction to the tafsir of the Quran. Israeliyat. I don't know how you would say that in English to look it up. There's a boatload. If you Israeliyat in Arabic, if you put that up, you're going to get thousands of sites information. Yes, brother.
So, if you go to YouTube and you check out some of the scholars out there,
Yeah.
reputed scholars,
Yeah.
and you listen to lectures about past history,
Yeah.
during the times of Moses and Noah, they go into so much depth and detail. Sometimes you wonder how would they get details like what Moses was, talking to with some person he met a stranger or whatever. You just wonder. So is there any way to
So
verify
that's,
that?
like I said, so here's what it is. Here's the Ahl Sunnah approach to dealing with this idea. If it's not in contrast with Quranic teachings, then you can narrate it, as the Prophet said. But you do not accept it as factual, and you do not assume it's a lie. You know it's not real when it goes against established Quranic and known from the authentic hadith teachings of Islam. So when you have a consensus understanding from our creed or our understanding of prophets, and then you have an Israeliyat or a biblical verse that is contrasting that, then we would not believe that's true, right? Like it just doesn't fit for me, honestly, that the
No, but
first
like
miracle
even
of
during
Jesus
the
was
times of
to
Cain
go
and
to a
Abel.
party and turn water to wine, so everybody can party out at the wedding. That doesn't feel right. Maybe wine to water, that sounds about right.
No, but even if it is an agreement, like how did they get those details about?
They're in the Israeliyat. So here's the interesting thing. Many Muslims are taking their religion as entertainment. I want to hear a cool story. Wow, what's that story, man? But I want to grow as a person of spirituality and make sure that what I'm doing it based upon is authentic. So that's a paradigm approach. Are we approaching going to an Islamic lecture or listening to an Islamic CD like we approach going to the movies or listening to music? Is it like trying to get a entertainment, or are we trying to establish a precedent for our soul, a structure and regulated lifestyle? So conceptualism is very important to the events that are authentic, so that we can understand, how to live by that. And that's what Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, what he was doing was very much like that. He was saying all these stories and dreams y'all are preaching in your sermon. Let's just get to the basics. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. What does that mean, right? Let's make sure we understand that before we go around the grave of so-and-so asking him for help. Right? Yeah, because they got some deep interpretations of the Quran to justify those things when we're saying every single day. In fact, it has something that said that's not the right way to be doing it, right? Yeah, so at any rate, yeah, you get a lot of that stuff from the Israel. So yes, it's okay to narrate it, but you need to tell people this story that I'm telling you, it is narrated that way by some people, but it's not. That's how all of those type of lectures should begin and end. This could be what happened, and we can take an example because our guidance tells us that these points that happen in the story could benefit us as a person. Just like telling any story. Like if you taught a fictional story, like if you saw The Matrix, it's a big lesson in Qadr, man. Yeah, isn't it? Yeah, so I mean, yes, sister.
Growing up, my dad used to tell us stories of Israeliyat, and he would just say, take it for what it's worth.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah, take
Fuck.
it for what it's worth. But I have a question. I wanted to see what your opinion was on this matter. For my kids, I like to have them experience different experiences, and I was wondering what your opinion was to taking them to like temples or churches or places like that, and having them attend. What would you say?
No, they should do that, to be honest with you. Not for worship, but for experience, as you said, to understand people, where they're coming from. And you know what? There was a brother there's a brother that I sought knowledge with in Michigan. And he actually embraced Islam when he was in a Catholic seminary studying to be a priest. He was giving his life to that. And he ended up living in an apartment complex with Turkish people above him. And these Turkish people were devout Muslims. And he was studying with the scholars and the Jesuit priests and all of that. And he would bring their stuff and then talk with these practicing Muslims. And their intellectual capacity to deal with those things was so strong that he embraced Islam. So now, fast forward about 10 years. As a new Muslim, he took a Salafi approach. I don't know if you're aware of that. So he had this kuffar, and those are kuffar, and he just cut himself off from the kuffar. And to be honest with you, he told me something that was very interesting. So I had asked him, they're going to be having an interfaith thing where some priests and missionary people are going to come from Florida, and they want to talk with us and have a theological discussion on all of this. He was like, no, those are kuffar. Why are you going to waste your time with them? They're just trying to spread falsehood. Why would you even waste your time in their evil presence, And so I was like, no, brother, I think maybe. And so he missed that one, but then he went to another one, which was at the church. And he experienced the church again, and then he listened to them, and he had a discussion with them. You know what he said? My faith rose. Through that experience, I realized that I had gotten stagnant, and I just took things for granted as a Muslim. That's just how we do things, and we're Muslim, that's the truth. We make our wudu in the morning, we eat, we say Bismillah, this and that, it's just a routine. But then I saw people who are basing everything based on very shaky evidences and tradition and routines that aren't based on any prophetic teaching. How you can get somebody saying, remember God and remember me as your prophet when you eat and drink, and then they decided we're going to turn bread and wine into body and blood and ingest the actual being to gain spiritual benefit. That's crazy, right? But so he told me that grew him an experience. And in my experience, that's the same thing. To go see how they're worshiping and all of that. So here's the downside of it, because we have to try to balance anything that we say. The downside is because Muslims have major issues in the way they function. Okay? Unfortunately, some people who aren't, you're different, but for other people, because you have, I know your family very well, alhamdulillah, may Allah reward you guys for what you do. But many people who don't have much knowledge, and they see Muslims and they see all the problems of a mosque and the corruption and the tit for tat and all of that, nitpicking and judging and all of that, and the rigidness that comes from some people. Then they go to a church and they see this loving, compassionate and all of that. They get caught up into it. Yeah, that happens. So some people lost their way because they went to a church with their friend a few times. And they thought, this seems like a much more accepting, warm, comforting place than any mosque I've ever been to. Yeah. But it depends on the mosque. I'm sure they won't get that feeling here, inshallah. But other mosques have that vibe. My dad, alhamdulillah, whenever I took him to give the other side of the story, first time my dad went to a mosque, I took him to the masjid in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was established and developed by Tariq Suwaidan himself. And so those people have been highly trained by proper, balanced, relative Islamic understanding. So he went in there and I showed him how wudu is, and then we went in and I introduced him to the people, and then he listened to the prayer, and afterward my dad was crying. And he said, I've never been to a place where people are so honestly sincere to get to know you and embrace you, and the lack of any pictures and statues and all those things, just this very pure worship of God and this cadence of the guy when he was reading it, it just really seemed really peaceful. So I tried to push the ticket of all becoming Muslim, but that wasn't enough for him. Wow. But I'd say in your case it would be a good idea just to expose them and then talk to them about it. Have a discussion after you leave. And a very tolerant, fair discussion. Like, those kuffar. I know you're not like that, but other people. Yeah, see what they do, they're worshiping Jesus. You know. Anyway, جزاكم الله خيرا. بارك الله فيكم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك. أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.